So with that, it's 6:01 by my clock. I'm going to get us started and just give a great big welcome and thank you. I appreciate everyone taking a couple hours of our evening to talk Lake Huron fisheries tonight, and specifically about the Lake Cheneaux Island area fisheries, these great fisheries of northern Lake Huron. This is our last of 3 Lake Huron fisheries workshops. We hold these annually each year with the goal of bringing together fisheries researchers and managers with anglers and coastal communities, and really anyone interested in being a part of our a conversation related to our awesome Lake Huron fishery. It's been a great series so far, and we're hoping for a great evening tonight. We have an action-packed agenda. So far, we've started with an open water session back on April 30th, looking at the open water fisheries. Last week on May 14th, we talked Saginaw Bay, and today we're talking about the Lake Cheneaux Island area fisheries in northern Lake Huron. And again, these sessions are recorded, so if you missed the first 2, feel free to look back. We'll send some of those links in our post-workshop correspondence that you'll receive. These workshops, including today's session, are going to be recorded. So we typically host these workshops in person, but given the current health concerns, we really can't do that. So I want to thank, again, our partners, many partners who really stepped up and said these conversations are important enough that we need to try to have them this spring, even if in a virtual way. So I want to thank our many partners, but I also want to thank you all who've taken time out of your evening to join. If you don't join, we don't have a workshop. So before I get started, I'll thank some of our key partners. We have a lot of research and management agencies and universities and organizations that have contributed a wealth of knowledge to this evening's session. So the Michigan Department of Natural Resources Fisheries Division, the USGS Great Lakes Science Center, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Eagle Office of the Great Lakes, Environmental Great Lakes and Energy Department, USDA Wildlife Services, you'll hear from tonight regarding cormorant management updates, and our own Michigan State University Department of Fisheries and Wildlife, and they collectively are also bringing in other partners into the conversation. Our community partners and organizations, again, we normally host these locally, and these a lot of partners help these workshops to happen in our coastal communities. But even though we're doing them virtually, these partners really still all help to communicate and get the word out, make sure everybody had a chance to be a part of this conversation to the extent they wanted to. So partners like the Michigan Charter Boat Association, the Michigan Steelhead and Salmon Fishermen's Association, Blue Water Sport Fishing Association, Hammond Bay Area Anglers, Lake Huron Sport Fishing, Saginaw Bay Walleye Club, the Thunder Bay Walleye Club, Thunder Bay Steelheaders, Detroit Area Steelheaders, and a lot of other partners. I just want to thank them on the front end for being great partners in communicating this opportunity out. And lastly, in terms of community partners, the Lake Huron Citizen Fishery Advisory Committee is an advisory committee to the Department of Natural Resources Fisheries Division. Frank Christ is the chair of that committee. Frank is joining us online tonight. It's worth noting that this committee gathers quarterly to really, have some deep discussions about our Lake Huron fisheries, and then they, of course, provide guidance based on that knowledge to the Department of Natural Resources. But our Michigan Sea Grant program, we value that committee as our advisors also. So they've helped throughout the year to think about these workshops, what information, where do we host them, what information we want to bring out to you today. And of course, Frank and I will be listening to your questions and gathering any feedback from our conversation tonight, and we'll be sharing that back with that advisory group. So again, Frank's with us, and that's an advisory group if you're ever looking to communicate information with the Department of Natural Resources. Just a quick scan through our agenda. I'll try to keep us on task here. The first session will be with Dave Fielder, having a broad discussion about the Lake Cheneaux Island fish community. Some of you are coming this evening with some questions about cormorant management. Tony Aderman is with us from USDA Wildlife Services. We'll follow Dave to talk more specifically about cormorants. Really excited to have Todd Hayden from the USGS to talk about a movement study looking at Cisco movement in the Lake Cheneaux Island area. Some really neat work they're doing. And then from our own MSU Department of Fisheries and Wildlife, a review of the Lake Huron, Lake Michigan Predator Diet Study. And in good tradition, we'll end with some management updates from Neal Godby, and that will be a broad look at some management updates and a chance to ask questions related to management issues or questions. So then, of course, I'm going to introduce ourselves, our Michigan Sea Grant team. So Michigan Sea Grant, we're a non-regulatory organization. Our interest lies at the intersection of supporting and promoting Great Lakes research and in the context of outreach and education, really thinking about how we can bring that research to life in our coastal communities. We're a partnership, we're a program of NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, but in Michigan, a partnership between Michigan State University, Go Green, and the University of Michigan, Go Blue. So a really neat partnership. I'm going to introduce, at this point, I want to introduce Elliot Nelson. If Elliot, you'll pop in. Introduce yourself. Elliot is my colleague in the Eastern Upper Peninsula, will be facilitating this evening with me.
Hi, everyone. Good to see some of your names, even if I can't see your faces right now.
Thanks, Elliot. And then we have an awesome communications team behind us, Cindy Hudson and Geneva Langland joining us tonight, helping with some of the background to make sure everything goes smoothly and awesomely tonight. So again, providing education outreach opportunities, just want to make a note that we have a great website full of resources and information on a variety of Great Lakes coastal topics that we cover. Drawing attention to two this evening. One is the not new, but newly revised Life of the Lakes publication, which is a deep dive into our Great Lakes fishery in terms of what our fisheries look like today, a little bit of the ecology and management that goes with that fishery, a dive back into history, thinking about how that fishery has changed through time, and then a look to the future in terms of issues, management issues, and opportunities. And then some of you may be interested, we just published hot off the presses a Salmon and Trout ID brochure of the Great Lakes. We would have handed this out in person, but obviously you can't do that, so it's available for download if you're interested. So again, a lot of great resources we'd like to get in your hands. We know that we have offices in East Lansing at MSU, in Ann Arbor at U of M, and we have coastal offices throughout the state of Michigan, and so we're out in the coastal communities doing work. If you have questions or need resources or want to link up with anything Great Lakes, give us a shout. We'd like to get that information out. And so I'll end on this slide with this idea that because we receive federal funding, we have a commitment to make sure that our information programs and resources are open to anyone and everyone without discrimination. And so again, that's a commitment to get our resources of our own and our partners out there for folks to use in our coastal communities. So tonight, we're talking fish. So I will jump us into that conversation. I'm going to leave this up for a quick second, link to where the recorded presentations will be found on our Sea Grant website. And I will segue into an introduction of Dave Fielder. Dave Fielder works with the Department of Natural Resources Fisheries Division. He's at the research station in Alpena, and has spent many years surveying and monitoring the fish communities of the Lake Cheneaux Island area. So with that, Dave, I'll pass the reins to you.
Okay, if you'll let me share my screen here.
Yep.
Okay, there we go. All right, so you should be seeing my title slide. Does that look right?
Yep.
Great. Okay, well, thank you, Brandon and Elliot and all the Sea Grant folks for finding a way that we could still have this workshop, which has become an annual tradition now for a number of years. And I hope our presentation is coming to everybody, that they're safe and healthy and getting through this difficult time. My presentation is titled with double-crested cormorant impacts in there, because that's really how I've organized this presentation in the past, with focus on impacts to yellow perch. And most everyone is familiar with the long history for this area in that particular dynamic. But I want to talk a little bit about the overall fish community as well. So I will touch on some other species besides yellow perch. Everybody here is probably familiar with the Lake Cheneaux Islands archipelago, but these labeled locations are where the main cormorant rookeries are, the nesting sites that hold most of the birds that will feed in and around the Lake Cheneaux islands, the channels, and the embayments, and potentially impact the fish community there. So I just wanted to show this to you, and I think Tony's going to talk a little bit more about these specific sites as well. The information I have to share with you tonight comes from really three sources. First is our annual Fish Community Assessment Netting Survey, and last year was our 50th one. It began in 1969, so a very long time series to draw upon. The same gear fished in essentially the same locations at the same time every year. So if we see differences in the catch, we can attribute that to changes in the population of the different species. Then there's the creel survey that's been periodic up until 2000 and has been annual since the year 2000. And that includes a combination of counting boats from aerial flights and then interviews with fishermen at the end of their fishing trip in order to find out what they caught. And that generates estimates of harvest and angler catch rate and overall effort or participation. Lastly is the cormorant monitoring, which is really done by the USDA Wildlife Services. That's the part Tony's going to be talking more about. But in addition to the different management techniques that they have employed over the years, they also do the nest counts. And that's really how we track the abundance of cormorants, which is obviously of importance. And that's what this slide is here, going back in time. And you can see that this is nest number. So if you look at the y-axis there and multiply that times 2, that's about the number of breeding adults that were in the region and any one of these particular years. At their peak, that was about 5,500 nests, so about 11,000 birds. And then there's some number of immature non-nesters there as well. Cormorant management in the form of culling and egg oiling was availed to the states and others in late 2003. Really, the management was first implemented in 2004 in the Lake Cheneaux Islands and was successful in bringing bird numbers down, as indicated by these nest numbers. And then management was suspended as a result of some litigation with the Fish and Wildlife Service that vacated the public resource depredation order there in about, what was that, probably 2017, I guess, or 16. There was partial management resumed in 2018 based on justifications over concerns for threatened and endangered species. It wasn't on the same scale that had been going on under the public resource depredation order. But if we look at the newest value there in 2019, it does look like it's leveled off or even dipped down a little bit. So that's been the trends with bird numbers. Previously, our management target had been set of just 500 nests each year. And you can see that we were really only ever achieved that in 1 year. And now we're, of course, not even getting close to that under this partial management. So I'm overlaying that same cormorant nest curve here just so you can see that sort of familiar shape. And I don't even have a y-axis for that. It's just scaled here on one of these other axes. These other data are creel survey statistics. So the harvest on the primary y-axis here, and that's the blue line. And then the red line is the angler catch rate. That's on this other y-axis. So that's the number of yellow perch per hour in the recreational fishery. And you can see how the fishery bottomed out at the peak of the cormorant nesting numbers. The blue arrow reminds you where management of cormorants was first implemented. And you can see that the angler catch rate has largely rebounded. And here's the most recent value, 2019, has come back up some. The harvest, however, has remained relatively low. So if the angler catch rate is fairly high, the harvest is low, that means fishing effort or participation is low. So what's really not come back to the Lake Cheneaux Islands is the amount of fishing effort or participation that was once there back in the 80s and 90s. But the angler catch rates are largely consistent with some of those pre-cormorant years. So we have a number of different metrics that we like to look at to sort of gauge what's going on with the perch population relative to cormorants. This is the the mean catch rate in our survey nets for our survey, the gillnet survey that I mentioned that's gone on for 50 years, and that's the blue line. And then the red line, of course, is the cormorant nest number again. Now, some of this dip in catch rate for our survey nets was a result of a change in station and where we were fishing some of the nets. So not all this decline is as a result of cormorants, but what we were looking for really was some recovery of abundance as cormorant numbers came down, and we saw that. Now, perch numbers had come down some recently, but most recently in 2019, they've come back up. Now, one way we can kind of compensate for that is to look just at the Hessel Bay netting station. That's our most consistently surveyed location throughout the time series. And here you can see how the number of yellow perch really bottomed out during the peak of cormorant abundance. Those spikes you see is the result of some recruitment that had gone on, and then they quickly became depleted again. More recently, perch numbers, well, they rebounded some, they went back down, but now they're climbing back up again. So this is average age. We age the perch that we get by looking at their spines. They have rings on them, not unlike a tree. And it tells us a lot about what's going on with the population. Here you can see that for a while, the average age was increasing, which was consistent with the cormorants feeding on young yellow perch. So the average age grew older until finally they reached depletion, and then the average age plummeted, so that basically all you were really having in the population were the newest members recruiting each time. We predicted that if cormorants were in fact driving these dynamics and their numbers came down, that mean age would climb back up. And in fact, we see that that's exactly what has happened. And now as cormorant numbers have started to creep back up, mean age is predictably coming back down. This is growth rate of yellow perch, and here we're using just the average length at age 3, just using 3 as a convenient indicator at the time of year that we sample these, which is in October, first week of October, sometimes the last week of September. This is in millimeters over here, but the state average rate for an age 3 yellow perch is right around 7¼ inches, so that kind of gives you a reference point. By the way, these error bars here are 2 standard errors, such that that's sort of like the 95% confidence interval. So you can look at those to sort of see really the range of where we think the true value is relative to the sampling that year. Now, what's really interesting is that the growth rate skyrocketed in response to cormorant proliferation. And the reason that is because growth rate in most fish populations is density dependent. So as you have fewer members in that fish population, the remaining survivors are going to grow much faster, right? Because they have less competition amongst themselves for food resources and for habitat. So we all like to see fast growing fish, of course, but that's really an indicator of a problem if they're growing this fast. And so we see that phenomenon, and then we predicted that if cormorant management was successful in bringing nest numbers down, and that they were in fact driving these dynamics, that mean length at age 3, the growth rate would also come back down. And that's exactly what's happened. Although now that we see cormorant numbers coming back up, some growth rate is also going back up, predictably. This is back to the survey net catch rates. This is the average number of age 2 or 2-year-olds, essentially. We're using this as an indicator of recruitment. Now, normally, recruitment, of course, is just how many new members of the fish population are coming into the population each year. Normally, we want to measure that at an earlier life stage, like yearlings or even young of year. Because of the mesh sizes being used in our survey net, we really have the most confidence that we're measuring age 2s in their full proportions of the population. So we're using that as our indicator of recruitment. You can see that we've had recruitment throughout this entire time period, including a record year here back in the year 2000 at the peak of cormorant abundance. One of the competing explanations for the decline of perch, instead of being cormorant predation, is that you have a recruitment problem or a reproduction problem. And you can see from this that that's not the case. In fact, what happened was these year classes were quickly depleted before they could become large enough to really recruit to the sport fishery, which back then had a minimum length limit of, I think, 7 inches. So here you can see the most recent value. This is 2019 on this bar here. And then in 2018, a fairly strong year class. So good reproduction, good recruitment going on, and that's always encouraging. Let's switch gears and look for a minute at northern pike, which have become a really important feature of the recreational fishery in the Lake Cheneaux Islands. We can see that they also experienced years of very low abundance at the peak of cormorant abundance, and their numbers have come up significantly as cormorant numbers have come down. Now, some of that could be driven by the higher water conditions of recent years, which favor pike reproduction. But generally, their survival is such that we think that they are also benefiting from lower cormorant numbers. Brown bullhead, maybe not an important feature to the fishery necessarily, but they are fairly abundant in the fish community, and they do serve as sort of an interesting indicator. And here we can see another period of lower abundance, or zero abundance essentially, during the peak of cormorant numbers. They rebounded also as well. Then we went through a lower period, and then more recently they're coming back up in abundance again. This is the same sort of data, a different looking graphic, but this is smallmouth bass. And they have generally been doing well since the early 2000s, and we see a huge spike in the last couple of years. We believe that they are a beneficiary of the invasion and colonization by brown goby. So probably partly this is a reflection of goby abundance that's provided for enhanced forage opportunities for smallmouth bass. I'd like to show this slide each time, because now that we have such a long data set here for the Lake Cheneaux Islands during our netting survey, we have a half a century. And this is the surface water temperature that we measure each time at the time that we're doing the survey there in the early fall, and plotted it out and then fit a line to it. And here you can see that over this 50-year time period that we are experiencing warmer and warmer water temperatures in the Lake Cheneaux Islands, which is consistent with climate change that we all hear so much about. So a lot of times when we hear and talk about climate change, we think sort of a distant place or a global phenomenon, but these things do have consequences locally. And if left unabated, it will have consequences for this fish community in the coming decades. So lots of people to thank, and I think I've left a lot of time for questions and answers, and I'd be happy to do that.
Great, thank you, Dave. Yeah, and so definitely this is a great opportunity this evening to ask questions. There is a question and answer box in the bottom. If you'd like to type in a question, please do. Dave would love to answer it. I did have one question that was emailed to me, Dave, that related to high water levels. So you talked about the importance of habitat in the context of climate, but we all recognize the high water levels right now, and
right.
Thinking about who are some of the winners and losers from that high water level, and specifically relating, specifically with pike in mind, northern pike.
Right. So pike, spawn and flooded vegetation, and as we have high water levels, a lot of times that, of course, the Lake Cheneaux Islands are famous for their coastal wetlands anyways, but if terrestrial vegetation is flooded like in some of the shallower embayments, that provides for just more spawning habitat and nursery habitat for pike. So that could absolutely be part of the phenomenon that's bolstering pike numbers.
Great, thanks. A question here about bass and higher water temperatures. Could the bass be benefiting from higher temps?
Yep, absolutely. Bass are going to be one of the winners, if you will, with higher water temperatures. Perch can probably adapt for a time to higher water temperatures. The higher water temperatures would have a greater consequence for a cold water species. So, yeah, smallmouth might be a beneficiary of that as well. Yep.
Thanks, Dave. Question about walleye. There's a lot of walleye in Lake Huron. What's the story with walleye in the context of the Lake Cheneaux Island study?
Really interesting that walleye are never a prominent feature in this fish community. And it's very much walleye-like waters. You would expect that normally because there's perch and other things there as well. But there really isn't any spawning tributaries in the immediate vicinity that would serve as a source of area for reproduction. And I think that's why there hasn't been a lot of walleye in this particular vicinity. So that's actually one of the secrets, I think, that it's been such a good perch fishery historically, is that there hasn't been a lot of walleye that could serve as predators on the yellow perch. There has been walleye stocking that's been performed by the tribes in neighboring waters, and we have seen a little bit of a signal of some increasing walleye numbers, but they're still a fairly minor component of the fish community.
Thanks, Dave. And this last question, there may be some questions still coming in, but relates to the birds, and it might be a question that we'll ask you and save for Tony as well. But how is high water levels seem to be affecting the birds?
Yeah, I think Tony's going to talk about that. As you can imagine, some of those shallow shoals that they nest on are being impacted in terms of they're just smaller areas now. Some of them are almost water, wave swept. So we'll look to Tony for some more information on that.
Right. Great. And so, and Elliot Nelson, I'm going to maybe shift to Elliot here to introduce Tony. Elliot is a bird ecologist through and through, and so you may have a quick word to say on that too, Elliot.
Bird ecologist might be a little bit generous there, but I'm pretty familiar on brood research and up to date on it. But Tony's the real expert here. Tony has been speaking at this workshop for quite a few years, and we're really lucky and fortunate to have him really committed to this workshop and to the area and to doing great work around here. And so I'm going to let Tony take it away and tell us a little bit about his recent work with cormorant management in the area.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is Tony Aderman with USDA Wildlife Services. I'm here to provide the 2019 Wildlife Services Double-Crested Cormorant Management Update. First, I want to start with the agencies involved with this project. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, they're responsible for providing a depredation permit, which allows us to do cormorant management here in Michigan. We also work very closely with Michigan Department of Natural Resources, both Wildlife and Fisheries Division, to help set our priorities for the management of cormorants here in the state of Michigan. And I work again for USDA Wildlife Services. We are a non-regulatory agency. That's why we rely and ask for help from these other agencies to be able to conduct this management here in Michigan. Here's a map of the Lake Cheneaux Islands. Starting down in the lower left corner of the screen, you can see Green Island there. I'll talk about this a little bit later on, but Green Island and Green Island Shoal is just a little bit to the west of it. That's just a little small island too. Fossil Shoal is completely underwater and gone. St. Martin Shoal is still above water to some degree, but for the most part, it's shrunk quite a bit in size as well. Goose Island, another nesting colony, cormorant nesting colony. Its size has shrunk as well. It's probably, without question, the biggest island within the Lake Cheneaux and has the most standing timber on it, but it itself has lost a lot of shoreline and has changed quite dramatically. Crow Island, going to the east, is lost a lot of real estate as well because of the lake levels, but still has cormorants nesting on it. Little Saddlebag Island, furthest to the east, has not had cormorants nesting on it probably since about 2008 or 9, something like that. And as you can see down there in the box in the lower central part of the screen, the nest counts. And I want to go back to that, and I'll have another slide here to elaborate on it a little bit more. But just so you can kind of see, in 2016, the Public Resource Depredation Order, or the PRDO, was vacated that year, and we ceased cormorant management and did not begin cormorant management again until 2018. So you can start to see just a slight increase with a couple years absent of management. Just real quick on this, I just wanted to point out, looking at the top there, Crow Island, back when we started management in 2004, there was only 68 nest pairs on the island. And in 2019, as you can see, there was 437 nest pairs. Quite a dramatic change for that island. Even in the event of management, you can see how everything pretty much was fairly stable until you get to 2016, when management stopped. Things seem to really kind of make a change for whatever reason. I don't know, and I can't explain it. But there was still only 157 nests on Crow Island, but by 2019 there was 437 again. The other ones that are quite a dramatic change, St. Martin Shoal. When we started, there was almost 1,900 nests on St. Martin Shoal, and by 2019, there's still only 216 on there. Goose Island, same thing, almost 1,800 nests there, still about 400. Been fairly consistent in the last few years with nest numbers out there. Here's just a bar chart. It kind of simplifies all that nest data we just talked about. You can kind of see how it's went. We've kind of plateaued ever since about 2008, somewhere, maybe 7, somewhere in there. We were able to bring the numbers down pretty quick right away. But then for various reasons, we were not able to really shrink it too much. 2012 is a little bit of a different year. I can't explain that exactly what happened there, but the nest numbers were extremely low for whatever reason. But as you can see, they rebounded, and again in 2016, when the PRDO was vacated and we could no longer do management, the nest numbers hung around that 1,022 mark, and then gradually increased. And then in 2018, we were able to get a depredation permit from the Fish and Wildlife Service to resume work, and still not able to bring the numbers down much lower than around that 12 to 1,400 range. So in 2019, here's our management. This screen's a little bit busy, but the first number is the nest number for each island. So on Crow Island, there was 437 nests. We oiled 355, and we ended up lethally removing 270. Goose Island, 396 nests, oiled 103, and removed 420. St. Martin Shoal, we just did a nest count. At that particular time under our permit, we were not able to do any management out there, so we did not oil any, and we did not lethally remove any. Green Island, there was 138 nests, 0 oiled, and 110 removed. Green Island is primarily all tree nesters. There's no ground nesters out there, so that's why there was no egg oiling there. Green Island Shoal, which I mentioned earlier, just a little bit to the west, there was 254 nests out there. We oiled 237, and we did not lethally remove any just because of the location of where the island is. It wasn't able to be managed lethally. So the total nests in the Lake Cheneaux were 575 oiled, and the total removed was 1,145. All right, moving on from the Lake Cheneaux, I'd like to give the opportunity for everybody to see where we have managed cormorants in the past. Starting in lower Lake Michigan, down at Ludington, that's basically at Consumers Pump Storage, their break wall down there. We did not do any cormorant management in 2019. At Ludington, Bays de Noc, we did do some cormorant management in Round Island. There's about 4 colonies out there, but there again, with the rising lake levels, it's really changed a lot of those islands, especially the smaller ones. 2 or 3 of them are currently underwater and no longer available for nesting cormorants or other colonial water birds. Beaver Island, we did not do any management in 2019. We're restricted to a lot of the islands out there as far as access. There is one state-owned island, Whiskey Island, but the nest numbers are fairly low, and we used our resources in the Lake Cheneaux and in Bays de Noc. Thunder Bay, we just did a nest count in 2019, and I'll be able to show you here in a further slide where those nest numbers have not really increased a whole lot there. Saginaw Bay, no management there as well. In 2019, our nest counts were the only thing that were conducted down there, and not a major increase there as well. So here in Lake Michigan, in 2019, kind of as I mentioned, here's just some of the numbers. Round Island over in Bays de Noc, it's a state-owned island. We're able to manage cormorants there. The nest numbers was 1,481. We oiled 283 nests, and we removed 1,481, essentially 50%. We did do a nest count in Whiskey Island, or in Beaver Island, and the nest count there was about 450. It's real difficult to get a good accurate nest count out there. It's extremely thick vegetation, almost impossible to navigate through on foot. So we did the best we could, like we have in the past, but that's about the best accurate estimate we could come up with. Trout Island, there was no nests and no management. So again, the totals were 283 and 1,481 from Round Island. I just wanted to give you back up again, as I mentioned earlier, just a little bit of history. In 2016, again, that was the year that the Public Resource Depredation Order, or the PRDO, was vacated, and we could no longer manage cormorants in Michigan. Those were the nest counts, as you can see, from Bays de Noc, Beaver Island, the Lake Cheneaux, and Thunder Bay, with around 7,300 plus or minus cormorant nests. 2018, not a lot of change. As you can see, in 2019, we were not able to get out to some of those islands in Bays de Noc and Beaver Island to get a real accurate nest count. I sometimes rely on some others that are out doing nest counts to get their numbers as well, and they were not able to get them. So That number in 2019, the total number down at the bottom, that 4784, is not a real accurate or depicts probably what happened in 2019. So I want to point that out. It was probably pretty close to around that 7,000 mark again, would be my guess. And this is just kind of going back in history a little bit and letting you kind of see how things have changed over time throughout Lake Huron and Lake Michigan. Again, keep in mind, in 2019, I feel like those numbers, because we did not get accurate nest counts in Badenoch and Beaver Island, I feel like those nest count numbers would still be somewhere up around that 7,000, 7,500 mark between all the locations. So our 2020 planned activities will, again, to provide pyrotechnics for some harassment efforts. That's going to be very limited due to funding, as well as providing harassment efforts at some stocking sites. We have done some already, but again, somewhat limited due to funding and the current situation with the coronavirus. We will continue to do nest counts on all the breeding colonies that I just mentioned earlier, from Badenoch, Beaver Islands, Lake Cheneaux, and Thunder Bay, as well as the Charity Islands, and possibly Ludington. We did apply for and received a Fish and Wildlife Service permit to do management, and pretty much the same sites as I just mentioned in 2019, which are going to be primarily the Lake Cheneaux and Badenoch. Depending on nest numbers, we may look at some management work in the beavers, but right now our primary focus is within the Lake Cheneaux and Badenoch. And that is the end. Any questions?
Thanks, Tony. Appreciate your update there. We got a couple questions coming in. So if you want to unmute yourself. So the first one, somebody asked, when you talk about removing nests, do the cormorants return and build new ones? Do they have multiple, egg laying abilities in a single season? What happens after the nests are removed?
Well, it kind of depends. Most of the time, if we're removing nests, it's primarily tree nesters, and yes, they will rebuild. But for the most part, once they reach a certain point in the season, generally around mid-June to I would say somewhere around mid-June, early July, it's getting a little bit too late for them to successfully put off offspring, so they'll generally just give up. But for the most part, we mostly just oil eggs and let them sit on the nest and incubate non-viable eggs, and they will not try to rebreed or re-nest based on that, because they get too late in the season again.
Thanks. Can you kind of reiterate what the high water impacts are on the birds and what you kind of see? Are they, certainly they're leaving some sites, are they just populating new sites, or is there a reduction from those higher water levels?
Well, it's a little bit early, and we really haven't started our management efforts full scale yet, but there is quite a bit of change with those islands. There's a lot of competition out there with other colonial water birds such as gulls and other things. So there's only so much real estate that cormorants can nest on. Even though they're adaptive to ground nest and tree nest. It's going to be kind of interesting to see what actually goes on this year. with cormorant numbers, because as I had mentioned, some of those islands are no longer in existence, that cormorants used to nest on. So I guess we'll just have to kind of wait till next year to see exactly what happens with all this, once we get out there and see what's really going on.
Thanks, Tony. Somebody else asked, is the Traverse Bay region a concern? Is there any management that goes on there?
There has not been, or we have not done any over there. The tribes have done some stuff over there years ago on Bellow Island. I don't think they have done anything since the PRDO has been vacated. I have worked with one group that has done some harassment stuff this spring, and that's pretty much all that I'm aware of that's going on over in the Traverse area.
Thanks. As expected, we're still getting questions coming in, so I think we're good on time. I'm going to keep asking a couple more, if that's all right, Tony.
Yeah.
So somebody else asked if some of the management or limits to management might be funding issues, and if they are communities able to fundraise to help address those, or is funding not really the issue here?
Well, funding's always an issue, I guess, but it's I think for this year 2020, I think we're okay. I think we'll be able to meet our when I say ours, as I mentioned earlier, Michigan DNR and our objectives to accomplish our goals and stuff like that. So we'll just have to kind of see how everything goes again this year, but I think for right now, I think financially, funding wise, we're okay.
Great. Here's another question. What kind of natural predators, and I might add to that, like what kind of natural causes of mortality do the cormorants have? What other things, or maybe competitors that might be kicking them out or something?
Well, I mean, outside of humans, cormorants are pretty smart birds, and really choose their sites or select their nesting sites very, very smartly. Raccoons, any of your mammals definitely have an effect on them, but cormorants, for some reason, they know where and where not to go. So you do not see them on inland lake shores and stuff like that, where a lot of those predators are available. As far as other colonial water birds, they seem to be able to get along fairly decent for the most part, and they're pretty successful. But they do not select locations where there's any especially mammal predators like raccoons, fox, things like that.
And then sort of a second part to that question somebody asked is how many eggs per nesting period do they typically lay? As a rule of thumb, it seems like as many years as I've been doing this, 3 is a pretty common average as far as number of eggs per nest. I mean, you see oddities as far as like 6 or 7, but for the most part, it's generally around 3, and that seems typical what they can support and carry out. We've got a few more rolling in, and we're still a little ahead of schedule, so I'm gonna ask a couple more. So when you reference in your graphs the number of nests oiled, and number removed, does remove refer to killed birds or just a removed nest? What does that specifically mean?
Removed is, it's just a nice word for we killed them.
So the adult birds or just the eggs?
Adult birds.
Okay.
And that is a little bit confusing. So clarification on that is nest oiled we just simply oil, as I mentioned earlier, we just oil the eggs, and it basically fakes the parents out that they're sitting on viable eggs, which are not, because the oil coats the shell and basically cuts the oxygen off, so that if you went in there and broke them, they would just try to lay more eggs and re-nest. So instead of having them do that and go through all that, they just sit on non-viable eggs. But we do, like in certain situations, like Goose Island, for example, where there's a lot of tree nests, we do go in and remove those nests. Actually, we pull them and knock them down because we're not able to access them by oiling. But birds removed, that's birds killed.
Thanks. All right, last question. Thanks for sticking with us throughout this. This one's just more a bit of a curiosity here. Where do double-crested cormorants winter, and what is their average lifespan?
Well, some of the stuff that was done earlier through our research branch, a lot of the cormorants that we see in the Lake Cheneaux and up through northern Lake Michigan, a lot of them are overwinter in Mississippi and Arkansas. Now there's going to be some variation in there, but just based on some band data and different stuff like that, that's primarily where they overwinter for the most part is Mississippi, Arkansas, Alabama, maybe a little bit some, but that would be the majority of it.
Well, thanks. We have a couple of folks too that just wanted to express their thanks for your work and giving us a great update. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Brandon to introduce our next speaker.
Yeah, thanks. And keep the questions coming. Again, we'll answer as many as we can between sessions, and then we'll circle back at the end to try to answer any questions we didn't get to. So appreciate the questions, and it makes for a great conversation. So next I want to introduce Todd Hayden with the USGS Center, the Hammond Bay Biological Station. Todd has been working with the GLATOS partnership, the Great Lakes Acoustic Telemetry Observation System, which is a pretty wide partnership that really is using acoustic telemetry to better understand how fish move. A really neat bunch of data coming out of their work, and some of you that has seen Todd share some work on different species. But Todd's with us today to talk specifically about Cisco and what they're learning about Cisco movements in the Lake Cheneaux Island area. So with that, I will introduce Todd and pass you the mic.
Hey, well, I want to first of all, thank Brandon for the very nice introduction and for the opportunity to get to talk to everyone here this evening. Before I get too far into it, I would like to take and just acknowledge the very large list of agencies and people that have been involved with this work. It's truly a collaboration, a large collaboration, and it really would not have been possible without all of these groups involved. So first up, what is a Cisco? Scientific name is Coragonus artidae, but there's a lot of common names. You've probably heard of the lake herring, that's common around the Great Lakes, but also they're called tubuli, blueback, and greenback. They're a fall spawner. They spawn in November and December, usually right around the first day of gun season, if you're familiar with the deer season in Michigan. The small fish eggs hatch in April and mature in about 3 to 4 years. Adults are pelagic, they form schools, and they eat all sorts of small things like plankton, insects, and eggs. And early on, from the mid-1800s to the mid-1900s, they were very extensively fished and supported several commercial fisheries throughout the Great Lakes. So at the bottom here, there's a number of images, a number of pictures of Cisco, and I want to just throw out there that most of the pictures in this presentation were taken by Andrew Muir, and he is a very, very fine photographer, and these images are really spectacular. But on the bottom left here, there is a picture of a Cisco, this is actually a Lake Ontario Cisco, but they look just like they do here in Lake Huron as well. And you can see it's a fairly small fish. The fish that I've been working with have been mostly in the order of 400 millimeters, or about 13, 14, 15 inches. Torpedo shaped, very silvery sides, and they have a little adipose fin here. And if you're familiar with some of the trout and salmon species, they also have adipose, because the Cisco is a distant relative to the lake trout. In the middle here, there's a close-up picture, and you can see some of the nice green pigmentation here over the back that gives them some of their names, you know, the green back or the blue back. And in an attempt to capture, in this bottom right image, some of the coloration of the Cisco, you can see this artist's rendering of that nice, very colorful fish. So in the Great Lakes, as I mentioned, the Cisco is been commercially harvested for a lot of years. These are some pictures, I believe, taken from the Green Bay area, but you can see, you know, they're processing fish here. And this middle picture is one of my favorites. It shows all the different small family fishermen that are harvesting Cisco and boxing them up for the market. And on the right, a lot of the Cisco harvest has increased and decreased a number of times through the history here. And here in the late 1800s, early 1900s, they peaked at about 2.5 million pounds. I'm sorry, 25 million pounds of harvested Cisco, and it peaked again here in the late 50s or in the 1950s, with slightly less. But then it declined over time, and it hasn't really returned since then. So why have the Cisco populations declined? Well, if you're familiar with any of the fisheries in the Great Lakes, you probably have a pretty good guess. It's pretty much the same story. Overharvest, unregulated harvest. Again, these are pictures taken from Green Bay, but wherever there were Cisco in the Great Lakes, you had this sort of harvesting going on. The second big one was the industrialization that occurred in the early 1900s. That changed the shoreline, changed the habitat, resulted in lots of pollution, low dissolved oxygens, and fish kills. All these sorts of events hit the Cisco pretty hard, and they failed to come back from it. The third big issue that have caused the Cisco populations to decline were the introduction of invasive species. Sea lamprey prey upon Ciscos. This is a rainbow smelt. Rainbow smelt, it's a small fish. It doesn't actually prey directly on the adult Cisco, but they are pretty serious predators on larval Cisco. And same thing with the alewife down here in the bottom. They both take and decrease Cisco populations by consuming the larval and juvenile Ciscos. So in Lake Huron, currently the distribution in U.S. waters is limited to the northern section of Lake Huron, from the Straits of Mackinac over here towards Manitoulin Island. This is really where Cisco are found in most numbers here in Lake Huron. And as you probably may know already, there's a pretty popular recreational fishery in the Cheneaux Islands in the middle of summer of Cisco. And the Cisco that we find here in the Cheneaux Islands, here's an image of the area, if you aren't familiar, is considered a coastal population, meaning that this population is thought to stay amongst the islands and just offshore, but fairly close to the Cheneaux Islands area. And what's really interesting, and I wish I had more time to talk about this, but the Cisco populations in Lake Huron historically, they were distributed throughout the lake, and historically they were comprised of several different forms of Cisco. And what that means is those fish, they look different, they act different, but they were still a basic Cisco. And so we've lost most of that diversity in Lake Huron. So for the rest of the talk today, I'll be talking just really about this shorthead Cisco that's found here in the Cheneaux Islands. So the overall goal is to restore Cisco in Saginaw Bay. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the National Fish Hatchery System are working to develop a brood stock program and a hatchery program to stock Cisco into Saginaw Bay. In fact, just recently in the last few years, they've actually begun to stock some fish into the system. The Lake Cheneaux Islands population is the source population for this work. And the overall goal, as I said, was to restore the Cisco in Saginaw Bay, but the plan here is to use this coastal form, which we think stays close to shore in fairly shallow waters along the northern shore of Lake Huron, into this very different offshore area of Saginaw Bay. And so understanding the movement of these fish could provide a lot of information about how and where we should stock these fish and whether or not this might work. There's some thinking that maybe this fish just isn't the right form of Cisco for Saginaw Bay because of their propensity to stay in these nearshore coastal sort of habitats. So why do we want to restore Cisco? Well, Cisco, there's a number of reasons. One of them is that it's a high energy prey resource, and it's a very effective vector for energy moving energy from the top of the bottom of the food web to the top of the food web. And it also provides a nice commercial and recreational fishery for humans. And why are we doing this now? Well, there's a lot of improvements in Lake Huron in terms of the habitat restoration. We have good dissolved oxygen in the lake now, so we can develop those populations again. The other one is, other big factors is that the alewife population has crashed dramatically, and the sea lamprey is pretty effectively controlled. So those eliminate some of the predators that have historically been a barrier to reestablishing the Cisco. And we've also restored the walleye in Saginaw Bay, which that means there's a high number and density of walleye in Saginaw Bay that are all hungry. So if we could provide a new resource, a prey resource for those fish, that would definitely help the population, both the walleye and the yellow perch that are presently being consumed some by the walleye. And also to reestablish these trophic linkages also between the nearshore and offshore habitats of Lake Huron and the bottom of the food web to the top of the food web. So, as I mentioned, my talk today is what I'm going to show you next here is some of the work we're doing to understand the movements of Cisco in the Lake Cheneaux Islands area. And I'm going to talk about two really simple questions. It's mainly a descriptive sort of study to understand these movements. Specifically, do the Cisco from the Lake Cheneaux Islands move offshore into Lake Huron? And then the second question is sort of a technical question. What proportion of tagged Cisco survive? And this is predominantly because if you've ever caught a Cisco on a fishing pole or anything like that, Cisco are very averse to handling. They're very sensitive. And so the idea of getting a tag, an acoustic tag into a Cisco so we can track its movement using acoustic telemetry is not a trivial task. So we used acoustic telemetry. I'll show you where we set up shop or where we put the receivers here in the next couple of slides. We tagged in 2018, 25 Cisco. We've tagged more in 2019. I'll talk about the future analyses that we're going to be doing here in a little bit. But we tagged 25 Cisco in Government Bay in November 2018. They were all right around 400 millimeters in total length. And they were predominantly males, and that's still an unusual, kind of an interesting question of why we couldn't find the females. We wanted to tag females, but we just weren't able to find them. So we tagged 23 males and 2 females. We used a 28 receiver array, acoustic receiver array, that stretched the Lake Cheneaux Islands and also into Lake Huron to look at these movements from inshore, offshore, as well as potential movements within the Lake Cheneaux Islands. And the movements, we tracked fish for about a year. The tags that we used have about a year's worth of battery life on them. And here at the bottom is a quick little schematic of how the acoustic telemetry works. You take and insert the tag into the fish. In this schematic, it's a lake trout, but it works just the same in Cisco, just a smaller tag. And the acoustic tag emits a unique signal. It beeps at a certain coded way that can be detected by the acoustic hydrophone if it's close enough. And that acoustic hydrophone decodes the transmission and records the day and the time that that fish was detected. And then by retrieving these acoustic hydrophones, we can download the information and have a record of where that fish was detected, where it moved while we were tracking it. So here's a few images from the tagging that we did in 2018. Here's a picture of some tags. You can see they range in different size. These larger tags, something you might put in a walleye or a lake trout. The tag that we used was much smaller. It was this one right here, the fourth one from the left. So it was substantially smaller. We teamed up with the Fish and Wildlife. They were collecting Cisco in the Lake Cheneaux Islands for gametes to support the stocking program, the hatchery program. We teamed up with their crew to capture Cisco. This is fun work. It occurs in the middle of the night and in November when it's not very pleasant out there sometimes. So we catch the fish with the electroshocking at night, and then we take and make a turn the fish over on and use an electric, low DC electric to immobilize the fish, and then make a small incision in the body wall along the stomach of underneath ventral side of the fish, and insert the tag. We suture the incision up, and then put the fish back in the water. The whole tagging takes just a couple of minutes, and you can see here in the bottom there is a video of tagged fish swimming around the recovery tank. So we put them in a recovery tank to make sure everything's looking okay. Once the fish are upright and moving normally, we release the fish right into the lake. And there are tagged fish in this tank here in the bottom video and untagged. And it's very difficult to figure out which ones are tagged and which ones aren't, which is exactly what you want. So the other part of the acoustic telemetry is the receiver locations and receiver deployments. This here in the top figure is an image of where we placed receivers in 2018 to track the Cisco. The red dots represent receivers. This is, of course, the Lake Cheneaux Islands. And then the dark coloration here in background, darker colors is shallow. So out here, the lighter blue is deep water, and the dark areas are these shallower shoals areas. Fish were released right in Government Bay, which is located between these two receivers. We released them right in the middle of that. So one of the tricks of doing acoustic telemetry is that you have to get these receivers back every year in order to take and download the data. We do that a number of ways. Here on the bottom right is a picture of what the acoustic receiver rigging looks like. You have a heavy anchor here at the bottom. You have a buoy at the top, and you attach the receiver and suspend it between the two. That gets dumped into the water with a snag line on a smaller anchor. And then the next year, when we need to get those receivers back, we have a crew of very accomplished technicians who are able to use GPS to locate the snag lines and recover them with a grapple hook. And if the water is too deep, then we use a different type of receiver that actually releases. You send an acoustic signal down to it, and it releases. It has a buoy on it. It floats to the surface. So this work is part of the Great Lakes Acoustic Telemetry Observation System. And this group is a network of researchers who collaboratively use acoustic telemetry to study fish movements with the goal of providing useful information to fish managers. But one of the things that the GLATOS framework or program does is it provides a mechanism for sharing detections. And what I mean is that I may have 28 receivers to track Cisco, but my Cisco may not know that that's where I need them to stay to be tracked. They may travel a lot further. So the GLATOS and that fish may be detected on another receiver that's being operated by another member of the GLATOS. And so one of the really important things that the GLATOS system does is it provides a mechanism for me to get receiver to get information about fish that moved and were detected on other people's receivers. So it provides a value-added sort of approach that my 28 receiver array suddenly turns into hundreds of receivers because it's part of the GLATOS. And the same way is that if my receivers detect any fish, then that information makes it back to the person that tagged those fish. If you have more information or want more information about the GLATOS program, you can take and go to this website, glatos.glos.us, and there is a fairly extensive web page there that discusses the projects and what's going on with GLATOS. Okay, so I'm going to jump right into results. I want to show you where the 25 fish moved with a little animation here in 2018, 2019. So at the top here is a clock that's going by day. The coloration in the background here, the dark colors are deep. You can see these receivers located out here towards in Lake Huron off of the Cheneaux Islands are in about 60 or 65, 70 meters of water. These receivers inshore are substantially shallower. And what I would like you to notice is that all these red dots are the fish moving around between the different receivers. So they're just connecting detections on different receivers with fish, okay? The receivers are the black. And if you'll notice here, we start off with a lot of receivers and we eventually end up with few. And the reason is that we pulled receivers in to download the data later in the time series. But what I want you to notice here is that early in the season, so in November, December, and even somewhat into early January, the fish were mostly detected up here in the Cheneaux Islands close to shore. But then, and we get into summertime, so in June, July, we start to see movement, more fish out to these deeper areas. So these fish are venturing out into the deeper areas offshore of the Cheneaux Islands. Okay, so to summarize, by month, if you take a look, I've just taken and color-coded the circles to the number of fish that were detected during that month. If they have a big X in it, that means that no fish were detected during that time period. And what you'll see, this pattern again shows up. April, the fish are mostly inshore. May, June, July, fish are moving offshore in deeper water. Okay, to summarize, over the entire period of time, we had between 5 and 10 fish that we tagged were detected out here in these deep offshore waters. Now, you may be thinking, well, that's not very many fish out of the 25 that we tagged. However, if you take into consideration the distance between these receivers as well as the detection range, so these tags are generally only heard for about 500 meters, and that's in good conditions. So if the water's calm and the fish are not moving very fast, then the tag can be detected by a receiver when the fish is about 500 meters away. These receivers here in Lake Huron are about 5 kilometers apart. So we truly have the needle in the haystack, where we're just trying to detect anything moving with very few receivers. There's a lot of water where these fish could slip through undetected. So detecting 5 to 10 fish in these very deep, in these offshore locations, suggests to me that these fish are moving out in these deeper areas and that they're moving quite a bit. That there's still a lot to learn to understand the movements of the Cisco in this area. So to summarize here, we saw offshore movements in summer and fall. The reason they do this, it may be, as Dave spoke earlier, the water temperatures are increasing in the Cheneaux Islands. These fish are not real happy in warm water temperatures, and it may be a mechanism to obtain some prey resources as well as to mitigate those warm temperatures. So the water temperatures is resulting in pushing them into the deeper water, deeper, cooler water. And I didn't really talk about it too much, but we looked at the survival of those tagged fish. 84% of the fish that we tagged were detected moving somewhere, but through June of 2019. That's pretty high. That was quite a bit higher than we expected going into it, just given the sensitivity and delicate nature of handling the Cisco. And the other last point here is that we have evidence that these fish are overwintering within the islands. They don't seem to move very far after they finish spawning, so they're staying in those shallow islands areas throughout the winter. And so this may provide an opportunity for sampling fish or even implanting more tags. So take-home messages here. The preliminary results that I've showed you here this evening suggest these Cisco are moving offshore during the summer, and that we can actually tag them and keep them alive. In the winter provides an previously unknown opportunity to tag Cisco or to sample them. So next steps. This project that I'm talking about tonight is really a preliminary project, a pilot project. We have plans and we are underway tagging more fish. In 2019, we tagged another 88 fish, and we also increased the acoustic receivers in the region. We went from 28 to about 100 and something, 120. You can see that we've got the area much more more receivers, much higher resolution to understand movements of the fish in the system. Okay, and before I sign off here, if you are more interested in learning some more about the Ciscos, and especially if you're interested in doing some learning about the different forms, different morphotypes that are found in the system, I would suggest pulling down this free monograph that was fairly recently published by the Great Lakes Fish Commission. Lots of really great photographs and a very nice account of the history of Cisco and Cisco fishery in the system, in the Great Lakes. And with that, I am finished and would be happy to take any questions.
Yeah, thank you, Todd. We do if you have questions, go ahead and type them in the Q&A box in the bottom. From Ken Drenth, Todd, he says, I live on Government Bay and have often wondered what was going on at night when we could see boats across our home in late fall with bright lights. Now I know. So some interest in the late night activities.
Yes, it's unfortunate that for us that the fish are there in the middle of the night and in the middle of November when it's not so nice.
So I'll leave the questions open for a little bit. And Todd, I'll just say, I appreciate that the GLATOS partnership and projects have been really interesting to me. We posted, thank you, Geneva, for posting the website in the chat box, and we'll send it out along with the link for this Cisco monograph in the post-workshop communications. I wonder if you, Todd, would mention a few of the other species that have been a part of this project. I know a few years back you presented on some walleye movement studies, but what other species are being tracked through this partnership?
Yes, there's a lot. I would recommend going onto the GLATOS webpage to get a sense of the projects. But some of the big ones, there's a lot of walleye work going on in Green Bay, for example. There are lake trout being followed all over the place. There's some whitefish work happening. Sturgeon, popular one. Sea lamprey. So just about anything that we could tag has been tagged for some particular project.
Neat, thanks. Question here, any telemetry work on the Drummond population, and do you expect any movement between those and the Lake Cheneaux Islands?
Yeah, that's a great question. We haven't gotten any tags into that Drummond population, but it's high on my list of things to try to find funding to do, because I think there is some really interesting, perhaps movement back and forth among those populations. Also, the St. Mary's River has a nice Cisco population. So it'd be nice to know whether or not these are all the same population, or if they are separate, different populations, or what the movement is among these areas.
Yeah, thanks. And I'll end on this question. Just a question, you mentioned water temperatures. So what is the water temperature of Middle Saginaw Bay in summer versus open water of northern Lake Huron? Basically asking, could too warm of water impact the survival of Cisco?
Yes, I think too warm of water could definitely impact the survival. I would imagine that northern Lake Huron and Saginaw Bay are probably pretty similar in terms of temperature. Saginaw Bay may be a little warmer, but it's probably about the same between those two spots.
Thanks. Well, thank you again, Todd, for joining us and sharing about this project. I will also note, you mentioned the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service restoration effort. Chris Olds from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service joined us for the previous two sessions to talk in a little bit more detail about that restoration effort. And so if you're interested in that, be sure to track that down. And again, we'll send links in the post-workshop communication. So thank you, Todd, and I'll pass this back to Elliot.
Okay.
Thanks, Brandon. So up next, we've got another great talk. Dr. Brian Roth from the MSU Department of Fisheries and Wildlife is going to share a little bit on the Lake Huron-Michigan Predator Diet Study. Brian recorded this presentation, so we'll get to see him or hear him with that. And then one of Brian's team members, Jake, who's a PhD candidate working with Dr. Roth to study predator diet changes, will be available to help answer any questions you guys have. As a reminder, feel free to put those questions into the Q&A at the bottom at any time during the presentation. So take it away, Dr. Roth.
Hello, my name is Dr. Brian Roth. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Fisheries and Wildlife at Michigan State University. I'd really like to thank all of you for showing up to this virtual fisheries workshop hosted by Michigan Sea Grant. I also like to thank Brandon Schroeder for allowing us the time to speak to you tonight about the ongoing diet project we're conducting in Lakes Michigan and Huron. It's really important to note that this is a pretty substantial undertaking, and there are lots of folks helping us to collect diets as well as other information that's pertinent to the project. These include volunteer anglers and sport fishing groups like you, who are helping us with some of the stomachs, particularly in this time of COVID, where we can't go out and collect stomachs ourselves. We'd also really like to thank the Michigan DNR creel agents, Indiana DNR, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service technicians, Wisconsin Sea Grant, USGS, and Michigan our trawl crews, as well as their other personnel that are helping with the project in terms of data collection as well as stomach collection. So in case you haven't seen me speak before, just to give you a short overview of the project, our goal is to determine species-specific diets in both Lakes Michigan and Lake Huron, and this is lake-wide. In addition, we're attempting to understand and determine seasonal as well as spatial trends in diet composition for each of the main predators in both lakes. In addition, and lastly, one of the things that perhaps is most important is that there is some thought that perhaps the diets that are collected from anglers may give us a skewed version of what is actually occurring in terms of predator-prey interactions. We're not necessarily sure that this is the case. However, it helps to have some evidence to demonstrate that. So we're comparing angler-caught diets in two ways. One is we're using trawl-caught fish, as well as gillnet caught fish, both in terms of lake trout and walleye. And we're also conducting a test using chemical tracers known as stable isotopes. So currently, as I just mentioned, all project activities have been halted due to the COVID-19 crisis. Should project activities resume this summer, we're hoping to really focus our efforts on diet collection and finishing up the analysis of the 2019 stomachs, which we were getting so close to finishing, yet we weren't able to back in March when we had to stop working. We did, and we were able to collect the stable isotope data in fall of 2019, and we were hoping to send those off in early March. However, due to some of the postponements, we weren't able to finish grinding those samples, and so we're hoping to ship them off to the lab this summer. If you'd like to know more information, particularly as it pertains to the comparison of Lake Huron to Lake Michigan, I invite you to go to this link on YouTube, which is Michigan Sea Grant's YouTube channel, to see the full talk that I gave at the open water session on Lake Huron. So just as a real brief overview, we've been sampling a lot of fish. So you can see the lake by lake comparison here in 2017, 2018, and 2019. And 2019 has an asterisk because we're not done processing stomachs. We think that maybe we have about 1,000 more to go, maybe 1,500, but we think that that's pretty close. And so as you can see, we've collected nearly 2,000 or over 2,000 stomachs on each lake from 2017 to 2019. So if we look at the sampling of Lake Huron through space, what we see is that if we look from the north in MH1 to the south in MH6, we see that we do have fairly good coverage depending on what species we're looking at here. So for instance, in MH1 in the very north, we have pretty good numbers of Chinook salmon and lake trout, but not very many walleye. However, if we look in Saginaw Bay, the opposite is true, where we have very few Chinook salmon and lake trout, but we have very good walleye numbers. Now, none of this should be a real surprise to you, given that we know that there are lots of walleye in Saginaw Bay, and Chinook salmon and lake trout tend to hang up north. Nonetheless, we've collected over 5,000 stomachs from Lake Huron over the past 3 years. When we look through time, what we see is that from spring until early fall, we have relatively good coverage in terms of our sample goals. However, in winter, early spring, and fall, we are really struggling to collect diets. And this is probably a factor for multiple causes. One is that we, MSU, as well as some of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife technicians and creel agents, aren't necessarily out collecting diets at this time for us, which I completely understand. We know people are fishing. However, what we're hoping to do is increase the number of anglers who are fishing that are willing to donate their stomachs to us during these periods. Overall, as part of the project on both Lakes Michigan and Huron, we've analyzed over 11,000 stomachs. And this includes some from as far back as 2012, not very many, most of which have been focused on 2017 to 2019. All of these are accessible to project collaborators in a database that we're relatively proud of creating simply because diet data can be relatively complex. However, we have some gaps in species, space, and time, and this is maybe in some part due to lower angler effort in the late fall through early spring, as well as our ability to efficiently gather diets. So really briefly, I'll go into some overview results from Lake Huron and Saginaw Bay. And it's really important here to note the prey items that I'll be describing for you. So for most part, we have alewife, which is ALE, smelt, SMT, round goby, corriganines, which are chubs, invertebrates, which are most oftentimes insects, sculpins, and then other. So in this diagram, I have other as being yellow perch or cyprinids, such as minnows. However, I break out yellow perch for us, for walleye, for Saginaw Bay, because they do represent such an important prey resource in Saginaw Bay. So when we look at some of the results from 2017, 2018, and 2019, across all these species, this is all the diet data we have over these 3 years. What we see is that, not surprisingly, even in Lake Huron, Chinook salmon, like alewife, they're in kind of that royal blue color. However, lake trout here, like smelt, here in red, as well as gobies. So depending on the year, their diet may be dominated by either round goby or by smelt. Steelhead here, they really like this light blue, which are invertebrates. These are bugs. And most steelhead diets from Lake Huron contain a tremendous number of bugs. However, when they're not eating bugs, they're eating rainbow smelt. Walleye, over here, really like round gobies, As well as here in blue, this would be primarily yellow perch, except for 2019, when we found one walleye that had 16 small Chinook salmon in its gut. When we look through time, what we see is some pretty interesting trends for lake trout. In early springtime, all the way through early summer, they tend to eat primarily gobies. However, as we get later in the year, they'll switch primarily to eating rainbow smelt. Through space, what we see is that in most locations, they're eating primarily round goby and rainbow smelt, with the exception of Saginaw Bay. And in this case, this is other fish. And in this case, these other fish represent a huge mishmash and diversity of different fish. Everything from brown bullheads and burbot to white perch, and even a few salmon here and there. But those are pretty rare. In terms of walleye, through time, what we see is something actually relatively similar, where in springtime, they tend to consume quite a few round gobies. However, later in the year, they'll switch to either rainbow smelt or yellow perch here in blue. Occasionally, they will also consume relatively odd fish like bullheads and Chinook salmon. In space, what we see may not be necessarily a surprise to you, which is that in Saginaw Bay here, their diet is made up primarily, actually the dominant component is yellow perch, with round goby making up a substantial smaller component of their diet. However, elsewhere, particularly here in MH2, which is further north, and MH5, which is further south, their diets are dominated by round goby. Now, granted, our sample numbers from these areas are much lower than they are from Saginaw Bay. Nonetheless, we are still surprised to see such high dependence on round goby in areas outside Saginaw Bay, and not so much in Saginaw Bay, even though round gobies are present there. One of the key factors that we can analyze in our diet study is how big the prey are. And luckily, we had access to some diet data from Ed Roseman from USGS from 2009 through 2011. And what we found is that in these previous study here in green, we can see that walleye were consuming yellow perch that were both larger as well as a broader range of sizes compared to what they're consuming now. In this case, they're consuming a single peak of prey lengths, indicating that they're feeding on a single year class. So to conclude, lake trout and walleye are eating a lot of gobies, particularly in early spring and early summer, and in areas outside of Saginaw Bay. However, later in the year, both species tend to replace round gobies, or at least supplement their diet, with open water fish, such as rainbow smelt or yellow perch. It also appears as though walleye are feeding on a single age class of yellow perch, which in contrast to previous years, indicates a much more limited prey availability. So in terms of next steps, we don't know. COVID-19 has halted all diet collection by both MSU as well as some of our partner agencies, and we currently have no way to collect stomachs. Thus, we really, really need your help. Even if we are allowed to go collect stomachs, it will take time to kind of ramp up sampling after a travel prohibition ends. We also lack adequate samples in a number of areas and seasons. So please, please, pretty please, and I'll even add a cherry on top, please donate stomachs to the project. We are really happy to provide any supplies and training that you may need. And if you need some help on board bringing in walleye or Atlantic salmon or Chinook or whatever the case may be, me or my graduate student Jake Sawecki or my lead technician Greg Byford are happy to provide that. So with that, I'd like to end and thank you so much for listening to this talk. If you'd like to stay up to date on the project, please visit our Facebook page here on the Huron-Michigan Diet Study, as well as if you're interested in collecting stomachs, Michigan Sea Grant has produced an excellent video displaying those instructions. So please ask any questions that you want, and either Greg Byford or Jake Sawecki will be happy to answer any questions you may have. Thank you.
Well, that was great. Thanks to Dr. Roth. And just as a note, down in the chat section, if you go to the bottom of your Zoom, click chat, we've been posting some of the links that have been shared, and in particular here on Michigan Diet Study, the Facebook page, and the Angler Diary, where you can help contribute and report, are down there. And so we really do encourage you, anglers that are out fishing throughout all the seasons, because I know I see you out there all the time, people, collect some stomachs for us and send them in. So we'll take any questions you have right now. You can, again, put those in the Q&A section. Jake, a question. Are there particular species or that you would really like from the Lake Cheneaux region, or that are lacking, or particular times of the year up here?
As far as species go, we're doing okay. I mean, Dr. Rock did mention the lack of walleye samples from the northern part of Lake Huron, but that might be difficult to get anyway, just because there might not be many walleye there. But time of year in early spring and later in the fall is really when we struggle to get samples. So that's pretty much the area that we're looking to get more samples from. We do okay during the warm summer months, but early spring, late fall, and winter, of course.
So another question is, are you just looking for Lake Huron? Where's kind of the cutoff point? If somebody catches something out by Drummond Island, or how far up the St. Mary's are you not looking for there?
That's a great question that I don't have a definitive answer for you. We're looking at Lake Huron, Lake Michigan, and that's it. No rivers, just Lake Huron, Lake Michigan, that's it.
So probably just send it in, and you'll use it if you can use it.
Yeah, with the data tags that are sent in, it has the location on those, and we can decide if it can be used from that or not.
Great. All right. Well, I don't see any other questions right now, and we're right about 7:40 to move on to our next one. But again, if you do have any other questions for Jake and their team with the diet study, please do let me know. Oh, it looks like actually we do have one more question. One last question before we let you go, Jake.
Okay.
Can folks take a look inside the stomachs before they send them to you if they have their own curiosities?
We do prefer to take stomachs that don't have holes in them already, just because there is a risk of, there are some small bones from fish that we use to identify a certain fish, and there's some risk of that falling out and not ending up in the bag. So we prefer not for people to send in stomachs that they look at. We do encourage people to look at the fish stomachs to see what the fish are eating, but we'd ask that they don't then send those to us, just in case some of those bones do fall out. We want to make sure we're really seeing what's in those stomachs.
All right, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to turn it over to Brandon now to introduce our last speaker.
Perfect. Thank you, Elliot. And thank you to Dr. Roth and Jake. Many of you, recognize how drastic the Lake Huron ecosystem has changed over the years. And this diet study over the years has been very important in really understanding how food is moving through the food web, and really thinking about how to use that science to make management decisions. And so a really important study, and really appreciate your citizen science contributions. So appreciate everybody hanging with us. It's a long evening, information filled, and lots of great content shared. And so in good tradition, we typically end these workshops with a conversation about management, some management updates, and an opportunity to ask questions or share concerns as it relates to management. And so I would like to introduce Neal Godby with the DNR Fisheries Division, who is here to share the management topic. I'll also note that Dave Borgeson and Randy Claremont, the Lake Huron Basin Coordinator, are with us tonight too. But I'm going to direct the rest of our time to Neal.
Good evening. I'm Neal Godby, a fisheries biologist for the Northern Lake Huron Management Unit. Thank you for the opportunity to present at this Lake Huron Fisheries Workshop, Lake Cheneaux Islands Edition. I'd like to point out some changes tonight to the fishing regulations for 2020 and let you know about a few of the regulation changes we are considering for 2021. First, however, I'd like to update you on some of the management challenges and implications we've experienced this spring due to COVID-19. We've had to reduce a lot of our activities this spring due to this unprecedented situation. Spring egg takes were not done this year for a number of species, such as walleye, muskellunge, steelhead, and Arctic grayling. This will have implications for 2020 and into 2021 as well. Stocking locations had to be altered or consolidated due to limited personnel and travel restrictions, and not all fish were able to be marked as planned. The travel restrictions and limitations were put in place partway through the marking of Atlantic salmon. Depending on the fish species, though, and what life stage, fish may not be marked or only some of them may be marked. Creel surveys and fisheries assessments and field work were disrupted as well due to travel restrictions and temporary layoffs. In late April and early May, 43% of Fish Division staff was laid off for 2 weeks. Currently, nearly all staff are on a temporary layoff of 1 day per week, which will last through July 25th. If you remember, in April, there was an executive directive which limited the use of motorboats, and there was a restriction on charters. For much of April, this restriction limited fishing effort and catch throughout Lake Huron during that time. Since then, however, the restriction on charters and motorboats has been lifted. Sea lamprey control has also been delayed, but the federal agencies are making every attempt to reschedule those treatments. I do want to point out that angler participation and support continues to be important in these times. For example, spring reports of coho salmon returns were very helpful in evaluating the stocking program. There are a number of new fishing regulations in place for 2020, some of which appear in the printed guide, some of which have been put in place after the guide was printed. Note that major regulation changes are outlined on page 2 of the guide and appear in red font throughout the publication. An electronic version of the guide can also be downloaded to your smart device at the web address shown, www.michigan.gov/DNR digests. Here's the table of general fishing regulations from page 12 of the guide, which summarizes the minimum size limit, daily possession limit, possession season for a variety of the most common species targeted. The new statewide regulation for whitefish and Cisco now also includes round whitefish, or Menominee, in the combined bag limit, daily possession limit. Note that this combined daily possession limit for the 3 species is now 10 fish for the Great Lakes and connecting waters, and is 5 for most inland waters. This change addresses concerns in the difficulty of identification of these species and recognizes that Cisco is a threatened species. This regulation change was discussed last year during our Coffee and Conversations program. Another change to the 2020 fishing regulations for Lake Huron occurred after the guide was printed. In fact, the guide directs you to online regulations or to call a phone number since the regulation had not been finalized at the time of printing. The regulation changes for Lake Trout in northern Lake Huron, or Lake Trout Management Zone MH1, which you can see on the map, and extends from approximately Rogers City north to the eastern UP coast and Drummond Island up to the St. Mary's River. For Lake Trout daily possession limits in MH1, the 2019 regulation was a 2 fish daily harvest limit. The 2020 regulation now is for a 3-fish daily harvest limit. This regulation is effective immediately and is correct in the online guide. The reason for the change is that the 2-fish limit was implemented to address an exceedance or overharvest of the harvest limit. That smaller bag limit reduced the harvest enough in 2019 and allowed for the increase to a 3-fish daily harvest limit 2020. This makes it consistent throughout Lake Huron of a 3-fish daily bag limit, so you don't have to pay as close attention to imaginary dividing lines of different lake trout management zones. There are also some proposed regulations for 2021 that we're looking for public feedback on. Sometimes we receive proposals from angling groups, and these proposals are then considered and maybe put forward for implementation in the following year. Sometimes, however, those proposals are changed and updated based on feedback. One of those regulations is for a party fishing limit. Currently, the daily possession limit for a group of anglers on a boat is per angler. Each angler has their own daily possession limit. However, angling is often a social activity, and anglers frequently share coolers or live wells when fishing. This proposal would allow combined daily possession limits of party members. What is a party? Party in this proposal is defined as 2 or more people fishing together from a single watercraft or on shore while maintaining unaided visual and vocal contact. An individual angler under this, though, can only transport their individual daily possession limit. That is, the combined possession limit is only in effect when they are on the same watercraft or sharing the same live well or cooler. This proposal recognizes that people fishing on the same boat will often share the same cooler or live well, and allows people fishing together to use a combined daily possession limit. We will be gathering input, and it will be formalized in a proposal to NRC in the fall. If approved, then will go into effect April 1st, 2021. We expect that this would maintain the desired protection of the resource and likely increase harvest-oriented angler satisfaction. In addition to the proposed statewide regulation changes for 2021, there are also some changes proposed for waters in the Northern Lake Huron Management Unit. This is a map of areas of responsibility for the Northern Lake Huron Management Unit. Our unit supervisor is Dave Borgeson. The areas I cover are in yellow and include the Eastern Upper Peninsula, and the areas covered by my colleague, Tim Selinsky, are in that pinkish or salmon color. Although there is a fairly long list of regulations that we plan to update for 2021, I will limit the discussion tonight to those that are more likely to affect anglers in the Eastern Upper Peninsula. One of the proposed changes is to trout lake designations for the 2021 fishing season. One of the changes is to Castle Rock Pond in Mackinac County, which we are removing from trout lake designation. It is currently a Type A trout lake. We recently decided to discontinue stocking of trout in this water body due to poor growth and poor survival of the stocked fish, so it did not make sense to maintain the trout lake regulations. This will also increase fishing opportunity as the pond will be open all year to fishing for species like yellow perch. Another trout lake regulation change is to Bright Lake in Hartwick Pine State Park in Crawford County in the Lower Peninsula. This lake is currently under Type A trout lake regulations, which does not allow for winter fishing. We're proposing to change Bright Lake to a Type B designation to allow for fishing all year and therefore increase opportunity. These are just a few examples of the type of regulation changes we might do in a typical year. Your feedback would be appreciated on these proposals, as well as general observations on fishing experiences. We like to get fishing reports from anglers and the public when fishing is good, as well as when the fishing is poor. Specifically, Let us know your thoughts about the party fishing limit proposal discussed tonight. I'd also like to hear about your experience with the 25 yellow perch bag limit, since last year was the first year of that regulation. Did it work out okay? And how was fishing in general? Here's the contact information for the managers of this area. Randy Claremont is the Lake Huron Basin Coordinator, while Dave Borgeson is the Northern Lake Huron Unit Manager. I am the biologist for this part of the management area in the Eastern UP. Please feel free to contact us with questions or feedback on these proposals. Thank you very much for your time tonight. Now we'll open it up to any questions.
Thank you, Neal. And again, we will take any questions regarding management, and I would also, as questions are coming in, offer or invite our collective group of panelists and presenters to turn on your cameras, and if we would like to circle back. I see there's some additional Cisco questions here that we passed by earlier. We can circle back to other questions too.
I do want to point out, Brandon, that Dave Borgeson is on the line as well. So if somebody wants to put him in the hot seat, they're welcome to do that too.
Yeah.
I'm happy to redirect any tough questions to him or to Randy tonight. So.
Yeah. Yep. And as I mentioned, Dave Borgeson, and then Randy Claremont, the Lake Huron Basin Coordinator, is here with us too. So a great opportunity from a collective group of some really smart people. So. I'm going to circle back, since we have some time, to some of the questions. There was a question about Cisco in McKay Bay. So we typically catch Cisco in McKay Bay during late June and early July with the mayfly hatches, yet data indicates the fish are moving out then. Is there a disconnect here?
So I don't think so. I think what's probably happening is those fish are moving around enough that they're sort of popping in and out, moving between those deeper offshore areas and moving into the bay. I'm not terribly familiar where the McKay Bay is, but I suspect if it's somewhat close to deep water, those fish are moving around enough that you'll catch them in eating mayflies, and then seeing them moving offshore into deeper waters.
Thanks. And another Cisco question, and this relates to the restoration project. The number of eggs being taken for the Cisco project in Saginaw Bay, does this have any bearing on the availability of the number of fish anglers can take in the Lake Cheneaux area? And so that's maybe a little bit of a management question.
Yeah, that's a better question for Chris Olds and maybe Dave Fielder. I don't think so. I think that they have other management targets there in terms of what they need to take and how many fish they need. I don't know.
I think the brood numbers of females that are being used for gamete collection is something like 45 or so. It's a pretty small number on a good weekend. A lot more than that are being taken out of the fishery. So I think it's pretty inconsequential.
Okay. I see Randy. Is there anything you'd like to add, Randy?
No, I mean, I think what this question is getting at is, would these egg takes impact potentially possession limits or other limits for Cisco or any of the Kriganines? And I agree with what Dave just said, that really the numbers used for the gamete collection is pretty small, and the fishery operates at a larger scale and likely fluctuates more with the mayfly hatch timing and other variables. So no, it shouldn't have an impact.
All right. Well, that might bring us to the end of our program, the end of our questions. I think I'll close us out here by just saying thank you to our collective group of panelists and presenters. It's a unique opportunity to have all of these research and management agencies and experts in the room. A lot of knowledge here in our virtual workshops. So I'll say thanks to our presenters, and I want to thank all of our participant attendees who took time again to log in and hang in through the conversation and share some really great questions and conversation. We appreciate having you a part of this. If you don't participate, we don't have a workshop to share. So thank you everybody for being online this evening. And I want to thank Elliot Nelson again for co-facilitating with me, and Cindy Hudson and Geneva Langland in the background helping to make sure things are moving along in good order. So appreciate everybody's contributions this evening. Hopefully you found it a worthwhile couple of hours talking Lake Huron fisheries in the Lake Cheneaux Islands.
And Brandon, I'm not going to try to steal your last word, but I'm going to try to steal your last word here. So I want to thank Brandon and Seagrant and all of your staff for the efforts that you put into these 4 series of workshops. So for the last 4 Thursdays, we started with open water fishery discussions, and then a coffee and conversations, and then Saginaw Bay, and ending tonight. So all those programs are available online. As a manager, I've received a lot of feedback from folks after the workshops, following up with technical questions, management questions. I know a lot of the presenters have had as well. So really appreciate everyone's effort. These have been just fantastic, and a lot of great feedback, great discussions, and it's very valuable for us as managers to know what people are seeing out in the field, especially this year, and what they're interested in terms of the best management practices for the fishery. So, Brandon, seriously, thank you. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, Randy. Thank you, everyone. I normally would say safe travels, but again, as I've been saying, I hope you all are safe at home right now. So thank you, and have a wonderful evening.